Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast with your host, Jeremy Thake. Each week, you'll catch us speaking to expert developers about new tech, lessons learned, and opinions in this space. I know. Where have I been? Where have we all been? We've been busy. I've decided to kick back off the podcast. Paul and I couldn't make it work as regularly as we wanted to, and I've acquired a whole new team at Microsoft now. But I bumped into someone at M365 Community Conference last week in Orlando. So welcome, Andrew.
Is this thing on? I've never done this before, so I don't really know what I'm doing.
We just spent 45 minutes explaining what a microphone was and how to set up something for a podcast with UAC because you're so new at this.
I've never done a podcast before. How does this work? Can they hear me yet?
So, do you want to introduce yourself formally so people know who you are? Maybe they haven't heard the dulcet tones of a Floridian on a podcast before.
Yeah, sure. I'm the one without the accent. I'm just kidding. I'm Andrew Connell. I'm a MVP for Microsoft 365 development. And it's been a long time since I've been in a podcast like this. Some people may be familiar with me from a podcast that I co-hosted for 8 years and 450 episodes with a good friend of a good mutual friend that we both have. So I'm back.
We might need to tell CJ, Chris Johnson, who was my boss at Microsoft in marketing and was a co-host on this show, and also my boss when I went to Hyperfish as well. So yeah, it's a small world.
So Jeremy, people may be listening to the show for the very first time or a brand new listener, and they may not know who this other guy is on the show. So why don't you introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about, what your background is and what you're doing these days?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm pretty sure a lot of the audience listeners are going to be the flow over from the great work that you and CJ did on the cloud show. So I'm Jeremy Thake. I've been at Microsoft now for nearly 9 years. I started my journey in tech actually in Australia. I graduated from university in London and moved to Australia and ended up in the .NET world and became a SharePoint developer and kind of evolved from there and ended up in the States in 2010 working for a large global ISV called AvePoint, and then joined Microsoft as a marketing person working on the M365 platform, and then moved on to be in product and started off in Microsoft Graph world. That's where most people are familiar with me from my Microsoft Graph aspect. And then just recently evolved into the Copilot development stack. And I mean recently in January of 2023, moved over when this all started kicking off. And so we pivoted my customer and partner team to work on all the Copilot developer extensively around Graph connectors. And we work really closely with another group within Microsoft that have customer product managers working on plugin development. And then in February of this year, I inherited the developer experience team that I'd started to form when I joined the Inner Arenas' group. And we've repivoted the team to focus on Copilot development. And so people might be familiar with MVPs like Sebastian Levert that I hired originally, and he moved on to this DevX team, and now he's back stuck with me again. But we have a really strong team of people that maybe aren't as well known in the DevX team, but I'm going to do my darndest to make sure everyone knows about them in the next 6 months with all the content they're creating, the tooling they're doing around Copilot development. So it's been really exciting to be in this space and evolve from the graph side. And then, obviously now rebooting this podcast to bring all of that goodness that I engage in across Microsoft for people to listen and consume on an audio tones versus through other channels that we get information out there from inside. But AC and I were talking last week, and we both missed being on podcasts talking about this work that we're also passionate about. And I think we just went, well, let's get on with it. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to have a bi-weekly show rather than a weekly just show so I can keep up with these commitments. And what I'm going to do is get Andrew on every other show. So we'll have product people on, which is what we were doing before with this podcast, from inside the walls. But then Andrew and I will have an episode where we'll chat about things with the Microsoft hat on to kind of keep things real and have Andrew represent, opinions from outside of the fair walls of Microsoft and have some candid conversations around that. So hopefully this format works and people are interested in it. I know I've missed hearing, well, both CJ and AC actually, but just having AC on is going to be really valuable, I think, for everyone to hear from an outsider's view with the work that he does out there in the ecosystem. How long have you been an MVP for, too? I know you said you've been MVP, but
I think so. I always mess up the math on this. I've been an MVP every year since 2005.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's either 19 or 20 years. Sometimes I see in the portal it shows that I've been there for 20 years. Sometimes it says 19 years. So I'm saying 19 years. But since 2005 is when I was awarded way back for Microsoft Content Management Server. And then I don't know, being at Microsoft, you may be familiar with the fact that things get renamed and products get merged and then products get killed and things moving around. So I've been from Microsoft Content Management Server to SharePoint to Office 365 to Office 365 Dev. Somehow I got stuck in an IT Pro like end user thing for a bit, which anybody that knows me knows that is clearly not accurate. But then so primarily now it's all around Microsoft 365 development.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I had your content management server book when I just started fresh out of university in 2001 and was doing .NET development back then, building on that. And then I worked at Redify, which was a well-known Australian consulting firm. And they were contracting Andrew's training content, which I was presenting all around Australia. And we became friends ever since. So, it's been a long history in this world. We've been stuck in Microsoft and Tahoe and SharePoint and Content Management Server. And what is now, I'm focusing a lot on Copilot development inside of M365. But no, I think it'd be good to keep the show going and a little bit of laughter, a little bit of technical stuff, and hopefully informing you on all the news that's coming through, both externally of Microsoft, but also within the fair walls of Microsoft as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what have you been doing?
Is it?
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I'm looking forward to it because it is, when CJ and I did ours, there was a time when I guess he jumped around to a couple jobs while we were doing that. But he was a time when he was at Microsoft and then he was out of Microsoft. Then he went back to Microsoft and then he left Microsoft again. And so it was a good, I'm looking forward to having these conversations with you, focusing on different stuff, giving you sharing with everybody an outside of Microsoft perspective. And before anybody listening to this, before anybody asks this question, I'm not trying to get Jeremy in a gotcha moment. We're not going to try and put him on the spot or be like, why did you do this kind of a thing? But I mean, I'm honest and I'm blunt with stuff. And so I'm hope that we can have some really good, I'm looking forward to having some really good conversations around the Microsoft 365 development ecosystem or Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And even, asking questions that a lot of people would maybe have, other people are interested in getting the answer to. So serving the role as playing, from the outside of Microsoft and just kind of sharing my perspective on thoughts. And then I'm sure we'll go deep dive on different features and different products and focus on different things like that.
Yeah. And I think that the key here is we want to try and keep it balanced where there's a reality to it as well. I think it helps to keep things real and kind of have that natural tone discussion to it and not just always toe the exact wording line. Maybe we'll have more listeners from Microsoft than we will external where they're making sure I say the right thing. But I think it's good. This is going to be my own personal opinions and having those discussions with product managers where they'll have their own personal opinions as well. We've been doing this show for a long time. We've been doing it since 2013, back with Richard DeZariga. And then Richard DeZariga took it on with Andrew Coates. And then I came back from Hyppitch back to Microsoft and I picked it back up again. So, it's great to keep this going. And we've had amazing guests on here and we'll continue that, but just a little bit more realistic pace now that the role that I have and the work that you're doing. I guess for those that are listening, that hopefully we pull over a lot of the fans from the other podcasts you've done. What have you been doing since you kind of retired that show?
It's a good question. Yeah. So It's funny because I ran into a few people at the conference last week, and they're like, they were begging to bring the show back. And I was like, yeah, we were done. Like that was kind of I don't know, whatever. We were done with that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this when I talked to the people last week, and I was like, let's just wait to put the show out. So if you're listening to it, the 2 or 3 people walked up after my sessions and asked, I don't want to say this is for you, but this is kind of for you. So since we shut the show down, it's funny because I actually was talking to CJ. So my co-host, Chris Johnson, we still talk on a regular basis. And we were talking actually just the other day. I told him I was doing this. He laughed kind of at me, I think, maybe. He usually does that a lot. But I told him I was doing this, and we were looking back at when did we actually shut the old show down? So it's been about 2 years. Most people today, I guess, know me as like a SharePoint framework developer. And so I've got SharePoint framework development class speaking at conferences about SharePoint framework and stuff, and how to extend SharePoint Online, how to extend Viva connections using the SharePoint framework. But in the last year and a half, 2 years, so I guess going back to the beginning of beginning of 2022, I started spending a lot more time doing work with Microsoft Teams development and app development.
Right.
And that's probably my primary focus today. I've done a bunch of content for Microsoft. I teach like an 8-week accelerator right now around teaching people how to get up to speed in an extended program. I'm working on some on-demand courses, self-paced courses around Microsoft Teams app dev. But I also the other tech that I've been focused on a lot recently, which has been a lot of fun and very refreshing, is SharePoint Embedded, which is I love how Jeff Teeper mentioned this. There was a SharePoint Embedded Dev Summit at the end of March this year, 2024. And the way he described it, I thought hit the nail on the head. It's basically like white label SharePoint. Yeah. So if you're a dev and you've wanted to be able to store content inside of SharePoint, but you've wanted to be able to say can I just delete the web interface, and I only want people to be able to access the content that I'm storing in SharePoint through my app? That's kind of what SharePoint Embedded is, but just to the point of document libraries. So for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a tech that says if you have a document-centric solution and you want best-in-class enterprise content management capabilities, versioning, security and compliance, record holds, all that kind of stuff. If you want that, you can go build those features yourself, or you can just say, I'm going to store all the data in SharePoint, and the only way you can get to it is through my app. And the app you build is essentially, it's like 99% using Microsoft Graph, which you and I are both very familiar with, and I find a lot of developers are also very familiar with it. So that's where my focus has been for the last 2 years, is around Teams dev and SharePoint embedded content as well.
Yeah, we'll need to get Reid Carlsberg on the show, who's the PM, one of the PMs on the SharePoint Embedded. When it first started framing, it was interesting because, being a SharePoint developer for a long time, there was often times where all I really needed SharePoint for was a SharePoint site collection for that exact purpose. It was like somewhere to drop, not just files, but also kind of list data as well, and not have to worry about scaffolding up things like version history and, data structures and stuff. And sure, you can do all that in Azure, and, you could use Azure files and so forth. But there are a lot of great things that you get with integration of having a headless SharePoint site collection that the SharePoint Embedded really gives a value to that. And so, it's cool that you've been focused on that. And that's part of, a new wave of work that, Jeff Teeper's org is pushing out, which is, it's good to see more investment there, and as well as in, obviously Microsoft's big focus is on AI, where everything's a Copilot, and you're seeing the icon in every single product right now. We just saw this morning GroupMe now has a Copilot, which I was like, what is GroupMe? Oh, this is a messaging app, right? That's got Copilot 2 now. That's great. And so there's definitely a push internally to have AI everywhere, but it's good to see core offerings like that where they've heard the customer need for it and working through that from a developer perspective.
It's going to be able to take advantage of all the AI stuff that we have in SharePoint as well eventually.
Yeah.
Like all the stuff that SharePoint Premium has, we're going to be able to take advantage of it. So yeah, it'd be fun. Maybe we can, in a future episode, we can like do a deep dive on it
when it's
still in public preview. So when it goes GA, maybe that's something we could dive into one time in one of these episodes.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I guess the advantage is like you're out there in the wild training both software vendors, but also enterprise customers to build with these things. I think your insight there is extremely valuable in these kind of technologies to push things through as well.
Yeah, it's an exciting one. I haven't seen. It's the two areas I'm focusing on. So this is the fun. What's fun about it is that so let me talk about the Teams one. Well, actually, let's do the SharePoint embedded one because that's what we were just talking about. On the SharePoint embedded one, I've been doing SharePoint development longer than I probably would like to admit. I've been doing it since September of 2003, so over 20 years.
There was people at this conference that we've been working with in this space for a long time. Some of them had walking canes, and I'm like, we've been in this industry too long. There needs to be some new blood come through in the fact that we're all getting old.
It's funny because we used to, I don't think we're going to get in too much trouble, but like we used to spend much later nights out in the hotel bars during conferences. Whereas like Jeremy and I, we were hanging out last week. And I think that the majority of our conversation this time happened at lunch a little bit earlier in the day. And it was just like, I'm done. Like I'm going to dinner. Like, what are you doing now? It's like 9:30. Like going, I think I'm done for the night. Like it's a little bit older, but the thing that's so cool about SharePoint Embedded to me is like, as a developer, I've been talking to SharePoint developers for, well, like I said, 20 years. And one of the things that we've always asked for is like, I want like a version of SharePoint that like has no UX to it. I can build an app on top of it. So to see Microsoft build this as a first class feature and the way it's being built as a developer, I would look at it and say, this is how I want it to be built. So it's almost like it's tricky to talk to developers about because in one sense, I want to build a course and sell training on it. But the dirty little secret, I guess it's maybe not dirty little secret, but the dirty little secret is that it's like, if you know Graph, you know how to do this already.
Yeah.
Like, because it's just, you're already using existing endpoints. There's a few new concepts you got to take advantage of, but for the most part, the CRUD part of reading and writing documents to your libraries is all the same stuff. So that's one thing that's cool because it's addressing a need that developers have asked for a long time. On the Teams side, it's been a lot of fun because I've seen like this theme of Teams app development not be as widely adopted as I would have expected it to be over the last few years. And the more that I've worked with customers, the more like Microsoft hired me to teach a bunch of classes for about 9 or 10 months in 2021, 2022. And the thing that I saw, those classes were all like staffed by Microsoft sales and field reps were bringing enterprise developers from enterprise customers in to say, my way of describing it was they're putting you in a class to basically get to tell you why you should care about Teams app dev.
Yeah.
And those people that I talked to, I was really surprised at how few of them really understood what you could do. They all thought that all extensibility happened with these other two options. And that's when I did this I taught these classes for like 9 or 10 months, finally changed it up the way I was teaching it to do it a different way, the way that I wanted to do it. And we saw like success metrics like skyrocket. And so that's where I was like, okay, this works. I'm going to teach it my way because I think this is a better way of doing it. And so it's a lot more fun. It's like I just launched a free email course, 9-day email course for people to kind of get an idea of like, so what options do I have available to me?
Yeah. And I think that perspective as well is useful. Like, actually, just looking at the episode 1 was actually with CJ and Sonia Kopchev when we all joined that marketing team at the same time back in 2014. And CJ, when I joined the team, one thing he stressed on us is the work that we do then was in marketing, and now I'm back in the product group, is we're putting things out there as they're brand new. They're brand new concepts. Like Copilot for Microsoft 365 did not exist 2 years ago. The extensibility platform we announced to build in May of 2023. And I think the big thing we have to acknowledge is like this won't be an overnight success. It's going to take a lot of repetition. It's going to take a lot of us showing what can be done and the art of the possible. And eventually it will pick up, and you'll see different waves of things going through with SPFX. You're seeing it now with Teams development as well, and Copilot will get there too. And so we have to pick on particular software vendors or particular enterprise customers that are committed to trying things early and pushing things fast and furiously through. And that's what our build event and our Ignite events typically are, is like showcasing those things to, tempt people to go look themselves for their own scenarios. And it is sometimes really hard work because developers get stuck on what they know in a lot of cases. There are people that will pick up the latest and greatest, but the vast majority of developers are cautious to pick up technology because they're not sure where it's going to go. And this AI wave is the fastest wave I've ever seen. The developer session we did last week at the M365 community conference, there was 180 people in the 101 session I did with Cameron Parker in my group. And 80% of the people put their hands up to say they had Copilot licenses within their organization, whether it was a customer or an ISV. And that really surprised me, because if you will roll that clock back to, say, a SharePoint conference in 2013, and back then BPOS was kind of where things were at with SharePoint Online. Mm-hmm. And in those days, not everyone was bought into the cloud. People were still talking about SharePoint Server and SharePoint Farm solutions. And we had a good, big job in our hand in moving people to SharePoint apps at that point in time, even before SharePoint add-ins and before SPFX. And we know we've been through a lot of evolutions there in that tech stack in SharePoint. And just to see the adoption of a new product like Copilot for Microsoft 365 and the interest in the developer story because of the AI drive in the industry is kind of a really exciting time to be part of this process. And hopefully in these podcasts with the people we're bringing in, you'll see the passion and the speed that we're moving on with all this new platform stack on top of Copilot, as well as with things like SharePoint Embedded and the Team stack and the SharePoint stack.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's funny. I had this conversation with someone on on LinkedIn the other day, when someone asked, like, how in the world do you keep up with this stuff? How do you keep up with this rapid pace, especially before it was already kind of fast, but now when we're looking at like with AI and Microsoft's pushing so much stuff about Copilot and sprinkling Copilot on everywhere, and it's not a slam at Microsoft for doing it, because it's like with everything, everybody in the industry is doing something with AI. And I think it's the ones that are like doing it to improve your productivity is the stuff that's really beneficial. The generated content stuff is interesting, but it's like it's good for demoware stuff. But it's like with the stuff that's really meeting the where the rubber meets the road, I think is where it's like really increasing productivity and saving people time. But back to your point, it is exciting now with watching the pace of things, watching how fast things are advancing, watching new scenarios that are being unlocked or where we're throwing gasoline on a fire in a good way. If that's a good thing, I'm just going to say that that's a good thing, throwing gasoline on a fire. I think it's fun. It makes the business more fun.
Yeah.
As long as you don't like feel like you have to consume every last little bit and find the stuff that is good for you. Yeah. Like a lot of people go to ChatGPT to ask a bunch of questions. A lot of people go to the Bing Copilot or Copilot in Bing or whatever it's called now, Bing Pilot. That I can't keep up with names. So it's like names change so often, especially at Microsoft. Names change so often, so it's hard to keep up with it. But
it's a full-time job for people at Microsoft.
What's that?
It's a full-time job for people at Microsoft. It's job justification.
It totally yeah, it totally is. I think that, but like, and then then there's other ones that some of us find that are like, I like this one more. Like I'm a big fan of like this one called Perplexity, and I love the fact that it's like it focuses on accuracy instead of just finding a whole bunch more content. And that's what I think is cool. It's like you just talk to different people. What are you using? What are you using here? And there's just so much stuff going on that you want to go to one of these conferences. You want to go to Build. You want to go like where we were last week in Orlando at the M365 community conference to just kind of ask people like, so what are you using? And someone said like, I've never heard of that. Let me go check that one out. So hopefully we can bring some of that to the show as well.
Yeah, and that'd be great. And then, for me, like you're saying about looking at the other AI products out there, seeing the evolution of the platform story and all those products is super interesting as well. Like with where OpenAI have gone, you mentioned Perplexity, like Google, there's lots of companies out there trying different things and trying to build ecosystems. And, Microsoft is in a really great position with the existing ecosystems we have from Teams and SharePoint and Office. But by no means are we confident enough that we know we're going to be extremely successful here without really putting a ton of effort. And I think Build is the first place where you're going to see that amount of like, hey, look, from last year, here are all the things we've been working on. And like every year, the march towards Build, like we're recording this on May 9th, Build starts on the 22nd. It's amazing to see things come together that are happening across hundreds of people in ship room meetings every Tuesday and Thursday at the moment. And it's just incredible to see those demos come together with like 2 weeks out. And so the energy at the moment inside the walls is really exciting. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone either in person in Seattle. The sun will be out for sure as a trick to everyone. The fact that it rains the rest of the year. But also online, we have a huge presence online streaming with Build. And so if you haven't registered already, build.microsoft.com. The keynotes will cover at a very high level altitude a lot of the new announcements. Barnum Bora, who's a good friend of mine that's also in Australia, actually, on the East Coast, whereas I lived on the West Coast. But we've known each other for a long time. We're co-presenting for the first time. And we have the challenge of talking through the developer's guide to customize it Microsoft Copilot as a session. And that's Tuesday, the 21st at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. And I say the challenge, I think the great thing about Microsoft is we understand we have multiple audiences between pro devs and makers. And we also know that people want to bring their own stacks as well as use our stack. And so there is a lot of choice that we're giving people with Copilot extensibility. And so definitely check those out because we'll go through it and we'll try and give as much of the why as well as the when to use what when kind of flavoring of that session. And then all the other breakouts go into the kind of the what and the how. And so, I'm excited for Build. And please, if you're there, make sure you come say hi, either after the session. Maybe don't interrupt the sessions we're presenting. Unless you've got a really good question, then absolutely. And then obviously the expo hall floor, there's booths and stuff there that people can come say hi to. So
I wish that I was going to be there in person. I love I'm the one that likes to lurk in the back and listen to see the reaction that people have to stuff that they're seeing. And then to hear the kind of questions that they're asking.
The questions are the most interesting for me because especially when we start sharing this externally, because they're so different. Like I did a user group on Monday as a guy that's been in the industry for 30 years. And some of the questions he was asking, I had never even considered that perspective before. And that's a really good perspective that we should be introducing into the way we talk about these things on stage. So it's great to get the different perceptions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like, okay, so great example for this. And it is a very same way that I do this stuff with my business, right? Where like I said, I launched this email class, this email course. And at the end of each lesson, if someone fills out their homework, it's just an open-ended response. Like, what do you think about this? What are you struggling with this? How would you use this in your projects? What kind of questions do you have? When you hear the questions that people ask, you always hear you hear questions and you think that you've got a pretty good idea of the kind of questions that people are going to ask. But what's cool is that when you hear someone else asking those questions of things that you didn't anticipate, you didn't have the imagination to come up with the questions that they're asking. It's nice to be able to hear it in their like what people are curious about and how. Do you address that issue? Or is that just something like I had a complete blind spot to that? I had no idea that you were going to ask that, or that's not a scenario we ever even considered. So like I saw a lot of that with like the SharePoint embedded stuff. Like, why would I ever use this? Why wouldn't I just use an Azure storage blob? And it's like, well, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, I never even considered that. Like that's the kind of stuff I think is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And from my marketing days and now with product days, like getting the messaging right, and like no message is ever perfect. There's always going to be something that doesn't land or doesn't fit quite right in the way you describe things. But when you start seeing other people use the messaging and the framing you've written or the slides you've written, and you're like, yes, it's working. This is finally coming together. But there's a little bit of nervousness and timidness on like, have we got this right? Is this going to really land? Will it resonate? And and that's why we want to test early in these smaller audiences and where the MVPs come into their own under NDA, and our ISVs in the tap that my group run comes into its own, because we can, pressure test it all first before we go out in front of 200,000 people, which is kind of the audiences you start to see it build. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. Definitely be interesting to see all the announcements you guys have.
Yeah. So we'll do a podcast with some of the product team as the next episode, and then we'll get you back on the 2 weeks after that. And, I'll be excited to see all your opinions and on what we announced and thoughts on those things. But look, I'm really excited for this. I'm glad we managed to talk ourselves into this in Orlando last week over a lunch, just for those questioning whether it was over a beer.
Nope, it was a Coke and a water. It was
literally a Coke and a water, and a Coke with no ice, if you know me well enough. We'll see you in 4 weeks, basically.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm totally looking forward to it. And hey, everybody that's listening to this, reach out to us. Let us know what you think. Let us know what kinds of stuff do you want to hear about? What questions do you want? How badly do you want me to grill Jeremy? I'm just kidding. But like how, what kinds of stuff do you want to hear about? We do this because we do it because it's fun and we enjoy like reaching out and connecting with people. But it's always interesting too to kind of find out like, what people want, and if that kind of meets our vision for where we want to go with this. Cool.
And the best places to reach us is probably on X, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I think that's two places that we both live in together. So if you mention us in either of those two places, we're engaged there with you, and we'll start to get putting in show notes and so forth to put the links together in as we're talking about different pieces like AC's newsletter and the build links to all the breakout sessions that are relevant for the stuff we're announcing in a few weeks' time.
Works for me.
Cool.
Works for me.
All right. Well, happy we got this one out the way, and onwards and upwards.
There we go. HelloWorld.Again.
Again. Thanks for listening to the Microsoft 365 Dev Podcast. Check out our show notes on www.m365devpodcast.com and follow us on X at M365devpodcast. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us a review on Apple Podcasts too. That's all, folks.